Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that you all know brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy, the free society. If you're new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org for 33 years of principled arguments for liberty. Happy New Year to everyone. Thank you for your great end-of-year support for FFF. If you haven't yet donated, this would be a great time to get a tax-deductible donation for 2023. But we greatly appreciate those of you who have helped us with our work. We couldn't do it without those of you that help us out in a bigger way, and we're just very, very grateful. I want to use this opportunity. My co-host Richard Ebeline is off doing something, and so he won't be with me today. And I want to use this opportunity to bring you sort of an update on what's going on in the JFK assassination field, because it really is incredible what's been happening of late. It's sort of a classic example that if you just keep persisting and pressing against this wall that they've erected, that finally the wall begins to crumble. And there's no question but that the wall has begun to crumble, the wall of secrecy that surrounds this assassination on the part of the national security establishment. Well, let's put things in context first. Okay. An assassination takes place November 22nd, 1963. Immediately, the official narrative is that a lone nut, communist, former Marine was just at the right place at the right time, and he decided that since he was a little man, he wanted to become a big man by killing a big man who was the president. And that's the end of story, that this lone nut just killed the president. And then, lo and behold, a couple days later, a man with mafia connections murders Oswald and therefore prevents him from talking. But it's all innocent. It's just happenstance that Jack Ruby was mourning the death of the president. He didn't want Jacqueline Kennedy to have to come back for a murder trial, and so he just decided to take the law into his own hands, and that was the end of story. Let's move on. Well, a lot of people didn't want to move on. It looked pretty suspicious, like this was an effort to silence this guy who, by the way, was saying he was innocent. That's what's kind of lost in this whole story. This is a guy saying, I did not do this. And so you would think that the press would say, well, let's at least investigate. Maybe he didn't do it. In fact, he went one step further. He said, I'm a patsy, which means I've been set up. So here's this guy in jail after being arrested. Something's going through his mind. He's trying to figure out what's going on here. And he's saying, not only did I not do this, I'm being set up. So clearly he has some idea in mind as to being set up. But throughout this whole thing, they established the Warren Commission to supposedly investigate the assassination, the principal member of whom is Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, former head, that Kennedy had gotten into a huge war with over the Bay of Pigs and had actually fired the guy. This guy is the revered director of the CIA, and Kennedy fires him along with his chief deputy. Johnson puts Dulles there on the Warren Commission, where he's really directing the whole thing. Everybody else had jobs, not Dulles. He was there like in a retirement mode. He was able to attend every meeting and control what was going on. So one of the first meetings, Earl Warren, who was the chairman of the commission, calls a top secret meeting of the commission and says, I've received very disconcerting information that Oswald was a government operative, an intelligence operative, which would make sense. This guy was a former Marine, and while he's in the Marines, he learns fluent Russian. He's studying Marxism, and so it makes sense that they've got language schools there in the military. And if he really was a genuine Marxist communist, do you think they would have let him stay in the Marines at the height of the Cold War? He could be reporting troop movements and so forth to his communist overlords. And then they stationed him at Tsuki Air Base in Japan, where the top secret spy plane for the CIA, the U-2, is flying out of. So Warren says, we've got this disconcerting information that he's an intelligence operative. And they're all freaking out, like, oh my gosh, how are we going to handle this? An intelligence operative for the U.S. government kills the president? And so they resolved the issue by just asking Dulles and the CIA, Richard Helms, who was director at that time, was he working for you guys? Oh, no. Of course not. And then the FBI also, oh, no, of course. Okay, end of story. And Warren says, you are ordered never to reveal the subject of this particular meeting. It is top secret. It is classified. No one will ever learn about this thing. And they order the court reporter to destroy the tape. But somehow or another, a record existed that they failed to destroy, and that's how we know about it. So for the first 30 years or so, this was the official narrative. And if people raise the notion that, maybe there's something going on here. Oh, conspiracy theory, because the CIA immediately sends out, not immediately, but like in the 70s, sends out a missive to its assets in the mainstream press that says, look, people are starting to suspect that we might have had something to do with this. This is how you handle it. Start smearing them with the label conspiracy theorist. And so that became a real asset of the CIA and the mainstream press to silence any suggestion that they had been involved in this. In the meantime, the policy is to keep most of the assassination-related records of the CIA, the Pentagon, the Secret Service secret. Now, this in itself is weird. Here you've got, supposedly, a lone nut that just happens to be at the right place at the right time, supposedly doesn't have any connections to U.S. intelligence, shoots the president, then he's killed. What's the problem? Well, the problem is they kept all their assassination-related records secret on grounds of national security. Well, what does national security have to do with this? I mean, we all know that's a ridiculous, meaningless term anyway, but what's the point of it? Kathy? No. That's my trusty dog. So, what? The United States is going to fall into the ocean because they released their assassination-related records relating to what is supposedly a lone nut? How can anything relate to national security when it's supposedly just a lone nut that has no connections to U.S. intelligence? So even that, it looked weird. And y'all who have read my book, The Kennedy Autopsy, know that during the autopsy, which was conducted just a few hours after the assassination at Bethesda Military Center, I mean, imagine, this is a civilian country, supposedly, and the autopsy of the president in a straight murder case committed by a civilian is being handled by the military. And then they swear everybody to secrecy there. You will not talk about what you've seen in this autopsy. Well, the reason is they were conducting a fraudulent autopsy. And that's detailed in my book, The Kennedy Autopsy. And why is that important? Well, as I've emphasized over and over again, there is no innocent explanation for a fraudulent autopsy. Once you establish a fraudulent autopsy, and that was established by Douglas Horne's books, his book, Inside the Assassination Records Review Board. Now, when I read this book many years ago, I look at it from the standpoint of a lawyer. As you all know, I had legal training, had a law degree, practiced law as a trial attorney for 12 years in Texas. And so I look at this in a very critical eye. And I've read a lot of books on the assassination. But as soon as I come up to something that's, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. That's not logical. I stop and I say, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. And so a lot of the assassination researchers have done fantastic work in this and finding this piece of the puzzle or this piece of the puzzle and that piece of the puzzle. But inevitably I'd find something that doesn't make any sense. When I read Horne's books, I'm looking at it very carefully, chapter by chapter. It's a long book. It's 5 volumes. At the end of it, I said, I'll be darned. This is the one assassination researcher that put it all together. There are no flaws in the case that Horne makes. And Horne, as y'all know, worked for the Assassination Records Review Board in the 1990s. So Horne, for me, puts the whole thing together. And that's where the fraudulent autopsy comes in. My book, The Kennedy Autopsy, and later The Kennedy Autopsy 2, is really a summary of the points that Horne was making. It's like an easy-to-read summary if somebody doesn't want to go through all 5 volumes of Horne's book. And then later, I encapsulate the fraudulent autopsy in my latest book, my newest book, which I consider the best piece of work I've done in this area, An Encounter with Evil, the Abraham Zapruder story. So these records are kept secret until in 1991, I think, 90 or 91, Oliver Stone comes out with his movie JFK, which posits that this was a national security state regime change operation. No different from the one that had taken place in Iran in 53, Guatemala 54, where they were targeting the president of Guatemala with assassination. We don't know that for certain, but they still won't release their assassination list. But clearly, Jacobo Arbenz was at the top of that list. And then later, there was the assassination attempt through the Chilean national security establishment in that regime change operation against Salvador Allende that left him dead. The kidnapping and assassination scheme that the CIA orchestrated against General Rene Schneider in Chile in 1970. So, and then, of course, all the assassination attempts against Castro. And so Stone says this was another national security state regime change operation because Kennedy was a threat to them. Kennedy had seen through had broken through and seen the racket that the national security establishment had established. That he went to war with the CIA over the Bay of Pigs. He was going to destroy the CIA, and the CIA knew it. And then after the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he resolved that crisis, the military called it the greatest defeat in U.S. history. And they considered Kennedy to be a bigger threat to national security as a domestic president than Jacobo Arbenz or Castro or Mossadegh in Iran or Salvador Allende in Chile. The biggest threat to national security was Kennedy because he was inside. He was the U.S. president. And here he is establishing good relations with Russia. Now, if you think establishing good relations with Russia or saying good things about Russia today is a cardinal sin, it was 100 times worse back then. And yet that's what Kennedy was doing in his peace speech at American University in June of 63, a few months before they assassinated him. He's saying, the racket's over. And you can read the speech. It was so remarkable. The Soviet Union broadcast it all across the Soviet Union or republished it. They had never done that before. And he said, we're going to establish friendly relations. We're normalized relations with the Soviet Union. We're no longer going to go on this anti-Russia hostility trip. And then in Cuba, he had an emissary in Cuba to establish normal relations there on the very day he was assassinated. Well, this was a super no-no for the national security establishment. It would have rendered them meaningless. You know, what do you need a national security establishment if you don't have this big official enemy? And so, they looked at Kennedy as naive. That if America followed Kennedy, which it was obvious they were going to do, that meant you wouldn't need a national security establishment anymore. You could restore a limited government republic, which is what we favor at the Future of Freedom Foundation. So Stone comes up with this movie that says this was just a regime change operation based on national security, this nebulous term. And so at the end of the movie, he's got this little blurb saying they're still keeping all the records secret relating to the assassination. Now, we're not talking about a confession or even any reference to the assassination. And nothing like that will ever be put in writing because the CIA, from the earliest times of the CIA in 1947 when it got established, the policy was never put anything in writing regarding the state-sponsored assassination. It's too dangerous, could leak. So you never find that in any records of the national security establishment. But what you do find is little meticulous pieces of circumstantial evidence. Now, circumstantial evidence, as any judge in the land will tell you, is just as valid in any court of law and any criminal prosecution as direct evidence. And that's what they were afraid of would be found in these records. In fact, that's how the fraudulent autopsy got established. That if you read through Horn's book, and then my book, The Kennedy Autopsy, you'll see that the circumstantial evidence establishes the fraudulent autopsy. And by the time you finish reading my book or Horn's book, you can't help but conclude this was a fraudulent autopsy, which necessarily means criminal culpability because there's no innocent explanation for it. No one's ever been able to come up with one. No one ever will. There is no innocent explanation for a fraudulent autopsy. So as soon as you conclude this was a fraudulent autopsy, your mind necessarily has to conclude criminal culpability, regime change operation on the part of the Pentagon and the CIA. There's no way around it. And so Stone, at the end of his movie, says they're keeping their assassination-related records still secret. This is in the 90s, early 1990, 91. It's incredible. And so there was a public outcry. It really goes to show you that the power of public opinion sometimes, that outcry, people were phoning their congressmen, writing letters, and that forced Congress into enacting the JFK Records Act, which mandated that the CIA and the Pentagon had to release their assassination-related records. And so they released thousands of records, much to their chagrin, because the Assassination Records Review Board, which was the agency charged with enforcing the law, was forcing them to do it. They kept objecting to this document and that document, and they could have appealed to the president. But the president made it clear that he was not going to overrule the ARRB, that he was going to go along with whatever decision they made. And so they have thousands upon thousands of long secret, 30 years secret records released. And that's how the fraudulent autopsy got established beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, I won't go into all the details. You can read Horn's book, which is really the authoritative book in this area. My book, The Kennedy Autopsy, which is really a summary of Horn's book. My newest book, An Encounter with Evil, goes into it. I'll give you one example. They were claiming that there was only one brain examination. Now, I know you all have heard about where's the brain? That's a side issue, totally irrelevant. What matters is that there were two brain exams, and they were lying and saying that there was only one brain exam. The pathologist, the military, was saying there was only one brain exam. The ARRB established that there were two. They were lying. And the official photographer for the first brain examination, a man named John Stringer, whose credentials are impeccable. He was an instructor in photography at the Bethesda Naval Medical School, where they were training students to be doctors. He said, I was at the brain examination. He thought there was one. And I took the photographs, and we cut the brain like a loaf of bread, or they did. The two pathologists that were present, Humes and Boswell. Well, that was normal procedure to determine the trajectory of the bullets. Well, then the third pathologist, Pierre Fink, he testifies that he was at the brain examination and that he says Stringer wasn't there. So that's how the ARRB was able to determine that they were lying. There was two separate brain examinations, one where Stringer attended and one where Fink attended. And at the second brain examination, they didn't cut the brain in like a loaf. So it's a totally intact brain. That's what we see in the record today, the photographs of the brain intact. Well, once you cut a brain with like a loaf of bread, you can't put it back together. So it was clear that what they did was they went to the Bethesda Naval Medical Center where they were training students, and they have all sorts of organs there to train medical students, like in every medical school, hearts and lungs and kidneys and so forth. They grabbed a brain and they came over for the second brain examination and used that as the official brain. So this is just one example of the fraud. There's multiple examples that are detailed in Horn's book and my book and my latest book. So in any event, you've got the JFK Records Act mandating the release, and they end up releasing thousands of records, like I say. But there's a loophole in the law that says you've got 25 years to keep secret whatever records you think are a threat to national security. Well, it's ridiculous. I mean, this is 30 years after the assassination, but somebody slipped that provision into the law, gave them some protection. So they keep thousands upon thousands of records secret for 25 years. All right, so when that deadline comes due under Trump, guess what happened? Well, Trump's there saying, he's acting like the big man. He's going to release these records. Well, the CIA got to him, and they prevailed on him in some persuasive way that this would be a threat to national security, Mr. President. Are you kidding me? These records, it's like, what are we dealing with now? 50, 60 years now? And so Trump says, okay, I'll go along with the CIA. And he gives them an extension of time for secrecy because they're over there claiming, well, if they release the records, the United States is going to fall into the ocean, or the Reds are going to take over America, or Cuba's going to finally invade the United States. All this nonsense. And so the next extension of the deadline falls due under Biden. And Biden says, when it comes due, he says, well, the pandemic, they haven't had time to research this. What? They've had 50 years or so to research it. It's ridiculous. So national security. And so they extended again. And then, but throughout this time, of course, those of you that are familiar with my work know that I was predicting the cover-up's going to continue because of these meticulous pieces of evidence that are left. They're incriminating, not a confession, not a reference to the assassination, but these guys know that these assassination researchers like Horn are very smart people. I mean, they study these things and they pick up the circumstantial evidence. That's how they established that there was 2 separate brain examinations, and they know that. And they know that the records contain little pieces of incriminating evidence that further fill out this regime change mosaic. But by and large, the mainstream press is just saying conspiracy theory. We've become accustomed to this. They just ignore the issue here. I mean, here's a state-sponsored assassination of a U.S. president that was no different from the regime change operations against foreign presidents or prime ministers, and it's just this, they would never do this. They're a very virtuous organization, the CIA. MK Ultra, hiring Nazis secretly after World War II. Very, very innocent organization. And so they extend the deadline again, and the deadline came due just a couple months ago. Well, everything changed all of a sudden. The mainstream press is picking this up. Now, this is in large part owing to a good friend of mine, an assassination researcher named Jefferson Morley. He's a former reporter for the Washington Post. He's had a website for years called jfkfacts.org. He has recently switched that over to substack.com. I would highly recommend, if you're interested in this subject, to subscribe to his Substack column. He's putting out the cutting edge stuff right now. He's giving everybody updates on what's going on, and he's giving analysis. I mean, his analysis is absolutely fascinating, the way he's putting things together. Now, Jeff is a good friend. He authored a book that FFF published called CIA and JFK, The Secret Assassination Files. And I have the utmost respect for everything that Jeff's doing. We don't agree on everything, but that's the nature of human affairs. The only guy that I really agree with 100% is Doug Horn. When I read Horn's book, as I say, it was like, wow, this guy put it all together. But Jeff has put pieces together that are incredible and fascinating. So Jeff has a press conference at the National Press Club talking about the CIA's records that are still secret. And this is before the deadline, the latest deadline. And they're calling on President Biden to just release these records, order the release, which Biden could have done. He didn't have to succumb to the CIA's plea to please extend the time for secrecy again. And at that press conference, there was a federal judge named John Tunham. This is a federal judge. He was the chairman of the Assassination Records Review Board 30 years ago. And he gives a speech there at the press club, or a little talk, calling on the president to release these records. He's saying these records should have been released years ago, decades ago. They should have been released right after the assassination. This national security stuff is just pure nonsense. And all of a sudden, the mainstream press grabs onto this thing. It's incredible. I mean, you can just Google JFK records or something like that, and you can see all the mainstream press. And many of them are starting to realize, you can see in the articles, that this national security thing is a bunch of nonsense. The United States isn't going to fall into the ocean. It's not going to be taken over by the Reds if these long secret records are revealed. And they're coming to the conclusion that the remaining records that they're keeping secret contain incriminating information. Not a confession, not a reference to the assassination, but incriminating pieces of the mosaic, like those 2 brain exams, that they know that there's something in there that they're hiding. And that's what some of the mainstream press, not, of course, I would say a small percentage of the mainstream press. The others are still in their la-la land. But you've got the most popular commentator on Fox News, Tucker Carlson, goes live on television and gives a monologue saying, there's no question the CIA was involved in this assassination. There's no other conclusion that can be drawn here. That's incredible. And then Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the son of Bobby Kennedy, who was the brother of the president, who himself was assassinated, he sends out a tweet that attaches Tucker Carlson's monologue, where he says, Yeah, my uncle was killed by the national security establishment, the CIA. So this is incredible stuff. Now, that didn't come as a big surprise to me because Kennedy had already endorsed JFK and the Unspeakable, James Douglas's great book on the assassination. It's the book that I recommend to everyone if they're initially getting started in studying this assassination. It's JFK and the Unspeakable. So all of a sudden, you've got this massive amount of publicity on an issue that, as you all know, we've been pressing on and pressing on. We did a fantastic conference a couple of years ago that I would invite you to see. I think it's quite possibly the best conference we've ever put on. It was certainly the best attended. And we've done a number of conferences on it, as longtime supporters know. And so you keep pressing and pressing and pressing, and finally it's gratifying that you achieve a breakthrough. But in any event, Biden extended the time for secrecy. Now, one of the big areas where Morley has been so fantastic is he filed a lawsuit against the CIA under the Freedom of Information Act that revolves around a guy named George Joanides, who was a CIA official. And in fact, when John Tunham, the federal judge that I made reference to, was giving his talk, he said publicly that the CIA had deceived the ARRB with respect to Joanides, and that they didn't discover the deceit until after the ARRB had gone out of existence. And Tunham said, if we had known the truth, if the CIA had not deceived us about Joanides, we would have proceeded in an entirely different way. This is incredible. This is a federal judge that is saying this, that the CIA deceived them. And Tunham actually has written to Biden saying, you need to release these records. And the next deadline's this coming June. I mean, it would be great to see a public outcry that took place after Oliver Stone's movie that forces them to finally release these records. And from what I understand, I'm not sure about this, I think Tunham has also written to the Republican who's going to be handling the Oversight Committee in the House saying, you need to take charge of this because they're not obeying the law that was enacted, the JFK Records Act. So why is Joanides so important, and why is the CIA so fiercely protecting his files? This is why Morley filed the lawsuit. He says, we want to see Joanides' files. And the CIA said, absolutely not. They released a couple pages or a few pages or whatever of his record, but they fought fiercely. I think the lawsuit went on for about 10 years. And the federal judges, the federal judiciary deferred to the CIA and said, oh, national security, we have to defer to the CIA, which the federal judiciary always does. They always defer to the national security establishment. Too powerful. Well, so where does Joanides fit in this situation? Well, if you read my book, An Encounter with Evil, you know that the CIA was targeting a group called the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And Morley makes this really clear that this was part of the COINTELPRO program of the CIA. Now, I know y'all are familiar with that they were targeting leftist groups for destruction. Who was the Fair Play for Cuba Committee? It was a committee that was calling for normalized relations with Cuba. They were against the embargo that had been imposed. Now, remember, this is in the early 60s. And there were prominent people, Truman Capote and Robert Scheer, who was a columnist for the LA Times for many years. Many prominent people were part of this. Some of them were leftists, some of them were socialist, communists, or whatever, but others were normal people saying, we just want normal relations with Cuba. We don't want to go down this road. Well, they were deemed to be a threat to national security because you just didn't do that here in America. Now, the CIA knew that the First Amendment protects organizations like this, but nonetheless, their position is the Constitution is not a suicide pact. We can't follow the Constitution if it means that the country's going to be taken over by the communists. And so just as they needed to remove Kennedy for trying to establish normalized relations with Cuba, they needed to remove the Fair Play for Cuba Committee for doing the exact same thing. And they were intent on destroying it, so they were infiltrating it. And so all of the circumstantial evidence points to their government operative, Oswald, is sent to New Orleans. Now, when he's living in Dallas, he's not making this big hullabaloo that he's a communist, that he went to the Soviet Union and all this. He's keeping a fairly low profile. He goes to New Orleans in August, and all of a sudden, whoa, boy, everything blows up, and he's a communist, and he's passing out these leaflets for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And Morley is established, again, through this meticulous research of studying the CIA records that have been released, that this was a CIA operation. They were using Oswald as a way to destroy the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, because what Oswald was doing was creating a ruckus. He was sending letters to the Communist Party saying, I've made you members of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Well, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee never did that. They were trying to keep a good reputation, and Oswald's trying to sully it by associating with the Communist Party. And he did that all on his own initiative. He had no members of this organization in New Orleans. And then one of the pamphlets he's passing out, he inadvertently put the return address to the offices, the side entrance to an office of Guy Bannister, a retired FBI agent who had ties to U.S. intelligence. And I'm sure he got reamed out over that. That's a pretty bad mistake. So as part of this setup, Oswald goes and makes contact with this organization called the DRE. And the head of the DRE was a guy named Carlos Bringuer. This was an anti-communist group, anti-Cuba group. And so Oswald has this big public encounter with Bringuer in the streets of New Orleans where he's passing out Fair Play for Cuba Committee things. And there's all this hullabaloo. It has all the makings of a fake fight. And the press comes and the cops come and they arrest Oswald and they take him to jail. And while he's in jail, he asks to see an FBI agent. An FBI agent actually comes to visit him. We don't know what they talked about, but pretty unusual because it was a disorderly conduct charge and he has contact with an FBI agent. So they have a nice little conversation. And then there's a big interview. The DRE organizes a big interview on radio with Oswald and that he's with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee and so forth. What nobody knew was and didn't know for many, many years, this is where the deception comes in with respect to Joanitas, was that the CIA was funding the DRE. They were essentially a front organization, but big money. I forget what the exact amounts are. Morley details it in his articles at his Substack column, but huge amounts of money. I mean, he was supervising the DRE. I forget what Joanitas' official title was, but he was operating out of both Miami and New Orleans for the CIA. So the minute that Oswald assassinates the president, guess who sends out a press release all across the country establishing that the president's been killed by a communist? That would be the DRE. And they've got all the ammunition ready. They've got the interview that was on the radio. They've got the big brouhaha that was in the streets. And so all across the country, communist kills president. Well, this was brilliant because everybody hated communists. The right wing hated communists. They weren't about to come to the defense of a communist who had just supposedly killed the president. And then you've got the left. They were terrified of being smeared. And ironically, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee has to close down now because the accused assassin is this big Fair Play for Cuba Committee. So they killed two birds with one stone here. They knock out the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. They end up doing a regime change operation at the same time, but they keep it all secret. You see, they don't disclose it to the Warren Commission that the CIA was involved in this operation. They don't disclose it to the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 70s, which had been reopened to investigate the assassination. They don't disclose it to the ARRB. In fact, when the House Select Committee investigations were going on in the 70s, there were two law students that were working for the House Select Committee who were very sharp guys, Hardway and Lopez. Dan Hardway and I forget Lopez's first name, Edwin, maybe Edward or something. And they were two sharp guys, but the CIA thought they were just law students. But it didn't take long for the CIA to realize these are sharp guys because they were starting to ask for pertinent records, these long secret records from the CIA. Remember, the House Select Committee is before the JFK Records Act. So Hardway and Lopez are saying, we want this record, we want this record. And the CIA realized, danger, danger, danger. They called Joanitas, the guy who had been secretly supervising the DRE, and that had set out that press release back in 63, November. They called him out of retirement to say, well, we've got this guy here. He's going to serve as a liaison for you guys. He's going to facilitate the records that are going to be turned over to you. He's going to make sure you get everything you want. In fact, it was the exact opposite. Joanides' job was to block Hardaway and Lopez from getting records, and he served as an obstacle the whole rest of the time for the House Select Committee. So when the ARRB is meeting in the 90s, they don't disclose this to the Assassination Records Review Board. They keep it secret that they had used Joanides back as a supervisor of the DRE, which had established Oswald's communist bona fides, and then in the 70s, this supposed liaison. And so the CIA, morally discovered, ends up giving Joanides an award for meritorious service. And so they disclose that, they show the award, but they won't disclose what he got the award for. I mean, what the meritorious service was. So this is the type of thing that they're worried about. The remaining records have to be incriminating. There's no question about it. And that's one of the gratifying things that the mainstream press is finally, some of the mainstream press is finally figuring out, that this national security thing is absolute nonsense. I mean, imagine 60 years later or 59 years later, and they're saying, if we release these records, Mr. President, the United States is going to fall into the ocean, or it's going to be taken over by Russia, or whatever else ridiculous is about that nebulous term national security. It's really one of the most ridiculous terms in history because it doesn't have any meaning. It's just as soon as somebody mentions the word national security, everybody, oh my gosh, Jacob, national security is at stake. And whenever you say, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean the United States is going to fall into the ocean? They get befuddled because nobody's supposed to ask questions like that. So that's where we are on this thing. That the time for disclosure has been extended now into June of this year, which was really dumb on their part. They should have just made it another 10 years because in June it's going to start all over again, and there's undoubtedly going to be more members of the mainstream press saying, "Release the records, release the records." Even if you don't buy into the fact that this was a regime change operation, why not call for the release of the records? I mean, to establish that you're right, that it wasn't a regime change operation. I mean, what's really funny is the number of people that are so scared that these records are going to be released, even while saying, oh, no, the CIA is a virtuous organization. It only assassinates foreign presidents, not domestic presidents. So that's where we are. I would invite you to read my book, An Encounter with Evil, all my books in this area, but my most recent book goes into a dimension that certainly is not part of these records, which further establishes criminal culpability, and that's relating to the Zapruder film. Now, if there was ever an assassination-related record, it's the Zapruder film. I mean, that was the film that Dallas businessman Abraham Zapruder took of the assassination. And for years, decades, they were saying that film got sent over to Life magazine over in Chicago. It's its printing press. And as it turned out, as you can see, that carefully detailed in my book, which really builds on the work of Doug Horn, that's not what happened. The film got diverted over to the CIA Photographic Center, National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington secretly. And then it gets taken from there after they made copies of certain frames and what they call briefing boards. It gets taken secretly to the CIA's top secret research center, photographic center, that was based in Rochester, New York at Kodak's headquarters. Nobody knew about this thing. It didn't get revealed until the Assassination Record Review Board years. Now, why would they take the film up there? What was the point of that? And then they bring back the film to Washington at the National Photographic Interpretation Center in copy format. Now, we know it was a copy because when it got there on Saturday night of the assassination weekend, it was an 8mm film, and it comes back to the National Photographic Interpretation Center on Sunday as a 16mm film. Well, it's impossible to take an 8mm film and convert it into a 16mm film. So that's how we knew they copied it. Why'd they copy it? That's all detailed in my book, An Encounter with Evil, the Abraham Zapruder story, which, again, I consider one of the best works I've done in the 33 years I've been doing this. And I invite you to read that book, and you'll see that there's also fraud, not just in the autopsy, but in this film. So that's my Libertarian Angle report for this week. Thank you again for your great support of FFF, and I look forward to talking to you next week.